They say the Blackwood River never gives back what it takes. On still nights, when the mist drapes over the water and the pines stand silent, a cry drifts across the Currenta woman's voice, raw with grief. Those who follow it vanish, their names added to a village's quiet roll of the lost. Ethan Walker did not come for ghost stories. He came for the science, for the untouched ecosystem deep in the Scottish Highlands. But the river does not care why you arrive. It only cares how far you'll go before you hear her. The road to Blackwood River was a narrow strip of gravel winding through endless stretches of dark pine and oak. Ethan Walker kept his hands steady on the wheel as the trees closed in around him, their gnarled branches clawing at the fading light. The sky above Scotland's highlands was overcast, a heavy ceiling of grey that seemed to press down on the land. The deeper he drove into Blackwood Forest, the more the world beyond it felt like a distant memory. He was here for work, not folklore. As a young biologist with a fascination for rare freshwater species, Ethan had received permission to conduct a survey of the river's ecosystem. Blackwood River, snaking quietly through the dense forest, had been largely unstudied for years. Remote, isolated, and almost forgotten by modern science. It was exactly the kind of place that could still hold secrets worth finding. The trail that led down toward the water was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and moss-covered stones. Every step was muffled by the thick carpet of needles underfoot. Somewhere nearby, the river murmured its presence a low, constant sound of water moving over stone, blending with the sigh of the wind that slipped through the treetops. Ethan paused to take a deep breath, savoring the scent of damp earth. Yet there was something else in the air, something heavier. The forest felt old, and not just in the way of trees growing for centuries. It carried an awareness, a kind of watchfulness, as though the shadows between the trunks were paying attention. By the time he reached the edge of the village, the sun was sinking. Blackwood Village was a scattering of stone cottages with steep roofs, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. It was the sort of place where time had slowed decades ago. People here moved with quiet deliberation, their lives set to a rhythm dictated by the land and the seasons. At the local inn, where Ethan intended to stay during his survey, the warmth of the fire in the hearth did little to mask the curious glances from the few patrons inside. A grey-haired innkeeper, Mrs. Fraser, served him a plate of stew and asked politely where he was headed. The river, Ethan replied with a small smile. I'm here to study its wildlife. Should be an interesting project. At that, the room seemed to grow quieter. One of the men sitting near the window shifted uncomfortably and muttered something under his breath. Mrs. Fraser's expression tightened. You'll want to be careful near the water after nightfall, she said, her voice low. Best to finish your work before the sun's gone. Ethan looked up from his meal. Why's that? She hesitated, glancing at the other patrons before leaning closer. You'll hear talk of her Morag, the weeping woman. She's been part of this place longer than I've been alive. Lost her child in the river years back. Died herself not long after, under strange circumstances. Since then, folk claim they hear crying along the banks at night. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A local ghost story, then? Believe what you will, Mrs. Fraser replied, straightening. But those who've gone down there after dark, some never came back. The man by the window added without looking up, and the ones who do come back, they're not the same. Something stays with them. Ethan gave a polite nod, but inwardly he dismissed it as rural superstition. He had spent enough time in small, isolated communities to know that legends like this were woven into their identity. Morag's story was likely no more than a cautionary tale to keep children away from dangerous waters. Still, as he walked back to his rented room that night, the wind carried with it the faint scent of the river and a distant sound, something almost like a woman's sob, rising and falling with the current. He told himself it was just the wind in the trees, but he found himself locking the window before he went to bed. The next day began with a pale light spilling across the forest. Mist clung to the ground, curling between the trees in slow, ghostly tendrils. Ethan set out early with his field pack slung over one shoulder, a pair of binoculars hanging from his neck, and his boots damp from the dew-soaked grass. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of highland morning that seemed to wake every nerve in his body. Birds called in short bursts from the canopy above, their songs echoing faintly over the soft rush of the river in the distance. By midday, he had taken water samples, noted the unusual clarity in certain shallow pools, and recorded sightings of freshwater trout darting between submerged roots. Every so often, he would glance up to see the forest's shadowy green pressing in on all sides. He worked steadily, losing track of time. When he finally checked his watch, the sun had dipped lower than he expected, painting the treetops with thin streaks of gold. A thin layer of fog was already beginning to rise from the river's surface. Deciding to take one last set of measurements, Ethan moved farther along the bank. The ground here was soft, scattered with rotting leaves that sank slightly under his weight. He bent to place a sensor in the water when a sound drifted to him. Faint but unmistakable. It was a woman's cry. Not a scream, not even a sharp wail, just a low, continuous sob that carried across the water, so fragile it might have been the river itself weeping. It came from somewhere on the opposite bank, from within the dense shroud of mist that now hung thick over the current dot. Ethan froze, his breath shallow. The sound rose again, tugging at something deep in his chest, though he could not have said why. He stepped closer to the water, scanning the far side. The fog shifted, parting for only an instant, and there between the silver ribbons of mist stood a shape. It was slender, unmoving. The figure seemed to be clothed in pale white, the edges of the garment blurring into the fog. Ethan blinked, and the form dissolved, leaving nothing but the rippling surface of the river and the quiet whisper of water against stone. A chill crept up the back of his neck. The rational part of his mind insisted it could have been a trick of the light or the fog itself. He was tired. The air was playing with sound. But as he packed his equipment, the crying began again, softer now, as though it were retreating into the depths of the forest. By the time Ethan returned to the village, the sky was a deep slate grey, and the first hints of night had fallen. Several villagers stood near the inn's entrance, talking in low voices. When they saw him, the conversation died. Mrs. Fraser met him halfway up the path, her eyes scanning his face. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "I heard something." Her jaw tightened. "You'd do well to leave it at that, lad. Stay inside at night, and if you hear it again, don't follow." The man by the window in the inn last night stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Curiosity's taken more than one soul here. Don't let it take yours." Ethan forced a small smile, but his hands were still cold from the riverside air. That night, lying in bed, he replayed the sound in his mind, the way it rose and fell, the way it seemed to reach for him across the water. And no matter how he tried to reason it away, he could not deny one thing. It had sounded heartbreakingly human. The following morning, the sky was a dull pewter, and a steady drizzle had begun to fall over Blackwood village. Rain beaded on the slate roofs and trickled down the narrow lanes, carrying the scent of wet stone and wood smoke. Ethan lingered over his breakfast at the inn, sipping coffee while the low murmur of conversation filled the room. He could not shake the memory of the cry he had heard by the river. It lingered in his mind like a song half remembered, drawing him back toward the water, even as common sense urged him to stay away. As he was packing his notebook, Mrs. Fraser approached his table with a pot of tea and a measuring glance. "You won't be going out in this rain, I hope," she said. "Not until it eases," Ethan replied, then hesitated. "But I would like to know more about the story you mentioned. The woman by the river. Morag, was it?" Mrs. Fraser's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she seemed ready to refuse, but then she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Morag lived in a small wooden cabin by the eastern bend of the river," she began. "This was many years ago. She had a daughter Lynn, no more than 8 years old. The girl was bright, sweet, always seen playing by the water. One night, during a sudden flood, Lynn was swept away. No one saw her again. The inn's fire crackled in the silence that followed." Ethan leaned forward. "And Morag, she searched the river for days," Mrs. Fraser continued, her voice low. "Barefoot, without food or rest, calling her daughter's name until her voice was raw. People tried to help, but she wouldn't let them. Then, one morning, she was gone. No sign of her anywhere. Some said she went into the water to join her child. Others claimed they saw her after that, standing in the shallows, crying, as if her heart had split in two." The man by the window, Mr. Campbell, looked up from his pint. "I saw her once," he said flatly, hair matted with mud, dress clinging to her skin. "She was holding something in her arms. Might have been a bundle of weeds, might have been." He trailed off, his gaze unfocused. Mrs. Fraser gave him a sharp look before turning back to Ethan. "Anyone who hears her crying is drawn toward the water. They say it's not a choice. It's like your feet forget how to turn away. And those who step too close." She shook her head. "The river takes them." Ethan tried to keep his expression neutral, but the details were unsettling. "You believe that?" "I believe the river can be dangerous," Mrs. Fraser replied, "and I believe Morag is still there. Whether you call her a ghost or something else, she's part of this place now." After she left, Ethan jotted notes in his journal, half for his research and half to keep the unease from creeping too far into his thoughts. He told himself it was just an old folktale, shaped over the years into something darker than the truth. Yet, the conviction in the villagers' voices was hard to ignore. That afternoon, when the rain eased, Ethan wandered to the edge of the forest. The river lay ahead, its surface a dull silver under the clouded sky. Somewhere along its length had been Morag's cabin, now long gone. Somewhere along its banks a child had drowned, and a mother had vanished. The legend might have been exaggerated, but the grief at its core was real. And as the wind sighed through the trees, he thought he heard a faint echo of its sound of a woman's voice, carrying across time. That night, the moon was a pale, imperfect disk behind a shifting veil of cloud. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the river whispering in his mind. Sleep came and went in restless waves until, finally, he gave up. Something in him, a mix of curiosity and stubbornness, pushed him to see for himself what lay behind the villages. Warnings. He told himself it was for research, but the truth was simpler. He needed to know whether Morag was a shadow of grief or something far less explainable. He dressed in silence, pulling on his boots and a heavy jacket, and stepped out into the cold. The village was still, every window dark. Only the wind moved, carrying with it the damp scent of the river. The trail was a narrow thread of earth, winding between towering pines that seemed to lean closer with every step. Mist thickened as he neared the water, swirling around his ankles and climbing higher until it clung to his face like breath. The river emerged slowly from the white haze, its surface shifting in restless patterns. Ethan's breath formed small, clouds in the air as he scanned the opposite bank. Then, through the mist, a pale outline began to form. It was slender, human, unmoving. The shape grew clearer, each step of the fog revealing more along. White gown torn at the hem, dark hair hanging in tangled strands, shoulders bent forward as if weighed down by grief. Ethan's pulse quickened. The figure raised its head. Even through the shroud of mist, he saw the eyes red-rimmed, hollow, glistening with tears. Her face was pale as riverstone, the features twisted with an anguish so raw it almost hurt to look at. The current between them shifted, lapping at the bank in uneven waves. A thin hand emerged from the folds of the gown, clutching something. To her chest. For an instant, Ethan thought it was just a bundle of cloth. Then he caught the faint outline of small, delicate limbs within it. The water surged unexpectedly, splashing cold against his boots. The ripples spread toward him, each one pulling with a subtle force, as though the river itself wanted to draw him in. Ethan took a step back, his boots slipping slightly on the wet ground. The figure did not move closer, but her eyes never left his. She stood as still as a gravestone, cradling her burden in silence, her gown fluttering slightly in the unseen wind. A shiver raked down his spine. He turned sharply and began to retreat along the trail, heart pounding in his throat. The mist swirled around him, closing off the view of the river dot. When he glanced back one final time, she was still there motionless, watching the faintest glint of tears catching the dim moonlight. And in that frozen moment, Ethan knew he hadn't just imagined her. The next day passed in uneasy silence. Ethan tried to busy himself with his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the figure in the mist, the pale face, the hollow eyes, the bundle in her arms. Every detail felt etched into his mind with the precision of something real, not a dream or trick of the fog. By evening, a light rain had started to fall, tapping against the inn's windows. Ethan was hunched over his notes when a knock came at his door. It was Harris, a fellow researcher from the university who had arrived that afternoon. He was taller than Ethan, with an easy grin and a voice that carried a trace of skepticism about most things. "I heard you've been chasing ghost stories," Harris said as he stepped inside. Ethan didn't smile. "Not chasing, observing. And if you'd seen what I saw last night, you wouldn't be so quick to joke." Harris folded his arms. "Then show me. Let's go tonight." Ethan hesitated, but a part of him was relieved not to face the river alone again. "Fine, but we stay on the bank, and if we hear anything, we don't follow." The two men set out under a sky veiled with heavy clouds. The forest was darker tonight, the mist rising earlier, curling low around the undergrowth. By the time they reached the river, the far bank was already invisible, swallowed by a wall of white. For a long while, there was only the sound of moving water and the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. Then, faintly, the crying began. It was soft at first, like a memory carried on the breeze. Then it grew clearer, closer, a slow, breaking sob that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck rise. Harris tilted his head, frowning. "That's not the wind," he whispered. The mist shifted. A pale shape moved within it, drifting closer to the opposite shore. Ethan's stomach tightened. The crying swelled, filling the air, wrapping round them until it felt like the river itself was breathing sorrow. Without warning, Harris stepped forward. "Wait," Ethan hissed, grabbing his arm. "I just want a better look," Harris muttered, pulling free. He moved toward the edge, the fog curling around his legs. The cry turned sharper, almost desperate. The figure became clearer, long. White gown, dark hair, the bundle in her arms. Harris froze, staring then the mist surged forward, swallowing him whole. "Harris," Ethan lunged after him, but there was only fog thick, cold, and wet against his skin. Somewhere ahead, Harris shouted, his voice high with alarm. It cut off abruptly, replaced by the roar of water. Ethan stumbled forward, calling his friend's name. His foot caught on something half buried in the mud. He bent and pulled it free, a silver bracelet, its surface slick with river water. The inside was engraved with a single word, Lynn. The crying changed then. It became louder, harsher, as if the voice was no longer mourning but calling, commanding. The sound filled the forest, echoing from every direction. A sudden force struck him from behind, sending him sliding toward the bank. His hands clawed at the mud, fingers closing on something cold and smooth. For an instant, it felt like a human hand, sea lifeless, gripping his. In return, with a desperate shout, Ethan tore himself free, scrambling up the slope until the river was a shadow behind him. The crying faded, but its echo stayed in his bones. When he finally reached the edge of the village, his lungs burned and his legs shook. Harris was gone. Only the bracelet remained. The following morning, a weak sun filtered through the clouds, but it brought no warmth. The village was quieter than usual. People glanced at Ethan as he passed, their eyes flicking to the silver bracelet in his hand before turning away. No one asked about Harris. No one needed to dot Ethan hadn't slept. The night's images looped endlessly in his mind, Harris disappearing into the mist. The cold grasp of that unseen hand, the haunting name engraved on the bracelet. He had no explanation, but he knew one thing: he couldn't leave without finding out what had happened. He followed the river upstream, past the familiar bend where he had first heard the crying, to where the banks narrowed and the water ran deeper. The ground here was treacherous, pocked with roots and slick stones, the air heavy with the smell of wet moss. It was here, the villagers had said, that Lynn had drowned. As the sun slid behind the trees, the light dimmed to a washed-out grey. The mist began to rise again, thickening until it rolled along the ground like slow-moving smoke. Ethan's breath quickened. He knew he was being watched. She appeared without sound, as though the fog itself had shaped her. Morag stood in the shallows, her gown clinging to her thin frame, dark hair plastered against her skin. Her face was pale and smooth, yet her eyes were empty, hollows bottomless, and fixed entirely on him. The bundle in her arms sagged as though it were heavy, its shape unmistakably that of a small child. The sound began softly, a broken sob. Then it rose, splitting the air with raw anguish. The river surged in response, the calm surface fracturing into restless waves. Water crept up the bank, lapping at Ethan's boots, pulling with each retreat like the tide. He tried to step back, but the ground sucked at his heels. The current swelled, foam forming in the center of the channel. The pull grew stronger, dragging him forward inch by inch. Morag raised her head, her gaze locked on his, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw something flicker there, not malice, but grief so deep it blurred into rage. The next wave hit with startling force, knocking him to his knees. Cold water surged around him, biting into his skin. The current grabbed at his legs, dragging him into the flow. His head went under, and the world became a whirl of darkness and roaring water. Through the blur, he saw her, a pale figure beneath the surface, hair streaming like ink in the current. Her hand reached for him. He could not tell if she was pulling him deeper or pushing him away. His lungs burned. Just as his vision began to fade, a sudden force shoved him upward. He broke the surface with a gasp, coughing violently as the current flung him toward the bank. He collapsed on the wet earth, chest heaving, the mist already beginning to swallow her figure once more. In the brief instant before she vanished, Morag looked at him with something almost human, sorrow too vast for words, and then she was gone. Ethan left Blackwood the next morning. The road out of the village wound between endless ranks of pine, the sky above the highlands still heavy with low, rolling clouds. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the silver bracelet resting on the seat beside him. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward it, catching the faint glint of the name engraved inside. Lynn. He hadn't spoken to anyone before leaving. The villagers had offered no questions, only silent, watchful stares as he passed. It was as if they already knew the answers, as if Harris's absence had been inevitable from the moment he'd set foot by the river. The further he drove, the lighter the air felt, but the weight inside him didn't lift. Sleep had been impossible the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound returned, the slow, aching sob that had filled the mist. The momentary pressure of cold hands pushing him toward the surface. She had saved him, or she had let him go. He wasn't sure which. By the time the village was far behind, the forest thinning into rolling moorland, the sound still clung to him. It followed him into waking moments, threaded itself through the hum of the engine, and lingered in the spaces between heartbeats. That night, in a hotel miles away from Blackwood, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Rain tapped softly against the window. At first, he thought the rhythm was all he heard. Then, faintly, came the sound. It rose from nowhere, low and fragile at first, then deepening into the same mournful cry that had haunted the banks of Blackwood River. It was not in the room, nor outside, but somewhere between, a sound that lived in his head and yet was far away, carried on a current only he could hear. Ethan pressed the bracelet into his palm until the metal bit into his skin. His heart pounded, his throat tight. The sobbing faded slowly, but it did not disappear. He knew it would return. Somewhere more was still waiting by the water, her grief unending, her voice a lure to anyone who wandered too close. And sooner or later, someone would.
Thank you for following.